A bullet split the air once, long ago, and it didn't just break the silence. It broke him. Every bit of softness he had in his soul evaporated in that single, violent moment. The man who was left behind wasn't a man at all, not really. He was a ghost walking his own land, a rancher who carried a silence so heavy it felt like a scar you could touch. It was a wound that taught him one brutal lesson: the world's kindness is a lie. So he lived like voices were poison and laughter was a ghost. The years pressed him into stone. Each sunrise chiseled away a little more of the man he might have been. The neighbors, when they dared to speak of him, did it in whispers. They called him the man who outlived his own heart. He let them talk. Their words were just wind. They mattered less than the dull ache of dawn breaking over his empty fields. His ranch was a sprawling, lonely kingdom under an endless sky. Herds of cattle moved like shadows across the plains. He worked them without joy, without anger, without anything but the cold, hard grind of necessity. Day in, day out, sunup to sundown. At night, he'd sit by a dying fire, his hands clasped, listening to the wind groan against the rafters of his small, empty cabin. His whole world had been whittled down to creek water and silence, wood and dust. He was a man who had chosen to endure, because hope was a fool's game. He'd tried once, years back, gone into town, tried the church gatherings, the barn dances, but the women there, they looked at him and saw something unsettling in his stillness. His silence was too sharp, like a shard of glass. So he folded back into himself, letting the vast empty prairie be his only companion. And then one evening, as the sky bled out in shades of ash and copper, two figures appeared at the edge of his property. They walked with the slow, grinding persistence of travelers who had seen too many miles and known too much hunger. At first, he thought his mind was playing tricks on him, that the loneliness had finally cracked him open and was showing him things that weren't there. But they kept coming. As they got closer, he could see them clearly. Two sisters. Their hair was a tangled mess from the wind, their clothes worn so thin they looked like they were made of dust. Their presence on his land was more shocking than a rattlesnake's hiss. In 4 years, not a single soul had crossed his threshold uninvited. Not one. The elder sister stood tall. Her eyes were sharp, carrying a kind of strength that is only ever earned through loss. There was a challenge in her gaze, a silent dare for him to turn them away. The younger one lingered a half step behind her, softer, more fragile. When she finally spoke, her voice trembled as she asked for a sip of water. He didn't say a word. He just went and brought them a tin cup, his hands rough but steady. They drank like they hadn't seen water in a week, their throats working with a desperate, silent gratitude. He offered them a piece of bread, and the elder accepted it with a proud nod, even though her hunger was plain to see. The younger one just whispered her thanks, her voice like a hidden stream burbling under rocks. They didn't talk much that night, just enough to explain that they were fleeing a hardship they wouldn't name, seeking shelter from a world that had shown them zero mercy. He listened, his heart locked down tight with caution. But as he watched them in the flickering firelight, he didn't see strangers. He saw two souls carved up by pain, not so different from his own. The days started to stretch, one into the next, and the sisters didn't leave. He kept telling himself it was temporary, that they'd be gone with the next sunrise. But every morning he'd wake up to find them already in the yard, sleeves rolled up, their hands busy with chores he hadn't asked them to do. The elder sister, Ilara, split wood with a power and rhythm that said she'd done it her whole life. Her arms were strong, her eyes proud and fierce. The younger one, Lyra, tended to the horses. She had a gentle touch that could calm even his most skittish mare, a feat he himself struggled with. They gave their help freely, as if they understood that his silence wasn't a refusal. It was a fortress, and it unsettled him, the way they were slipping into the empty spaces of his life, filling them up. He had grown so used to the sound of nothing, so comfortable in the void. But now, there was laughter. It started small, like tiny cracks appearing in a sheet of ice. Ilara would tease him for his brutish, silent ways, her smile quick and daring. Lyra brought a different kind of warmth, humming small, forgotten melodies while she worked, her songs soothing the very air around them. He found himself listening, not because he wanted to, but because he couldn't help it. For the first time in years, silence no longer felt like safety. It felt like absence. The nights grew heavy with questions he refused to ask. He'd lie awake and wonder if this was the night they would finally leave. If he'd wake up to an empty yard, a cold fire, and a house that was once again echoing with everything it had lost. But every dusk, they were still there, their presence a quiet rebellion against the emptiness he had cultivated for so long. He never asked them why they stayed. Maybe he was more afraid of their answer than he was of their silence. Then one evening, with the whole prairie lying hushed beneath a thick blanket of stars, the sisters sat with him by the fire. Their voices, one strong, one soft, wove together as they finally confessed the truth that had been hanging unspoken between the three of them for weeks. They didn't want to just pass through his life. They wanted to bind themselves to it. They wanted to stay. Not as guests, not as wanderers seeking refuge. They wanted to be his wives, both of them, joined to him and to each other, in a union that would defy every rule and judgment of the outside world. His heart, that dead, useless stone in his chest, suddenly thundered awake. A storm broke open inside the quiet man, violent and terrifying. He felt the very earth tilt beneath his feet. He was torn between the cold, familiar comfort of his solitude and the wild, terrifying promise of a love he couldn't even comprehend. As their words hung in the night air, he understood that his life, his silence, his fortress, none of it could remain untouched. A choice was waiting for him, fierce and unavoidable, as the firelight flickered across three silent, searching faces. And what he didn't know was that their proposal wasn't just about love. It was about survival. And it was about to drag him back into the very conflict that had shattered his world all those years ago. The night after their confession felt like a lifetime. Sleep was a distant country he couldn't reach. He paced the length of his small cabin, the floorboards groaning under his weight like old bones. Every time he stopped, the silence of the house rushed in, demanding an answer he didn't have. Outside, the prairie was a vast, dark ocean, indifferent to the storm raging inside him. The stars were cold and bright, as if they were mocking his confusion. For years, he had built his entire existence on the belief that his heart was dead and buried. And now, two women were asking him to tear down every wall, to break every rule he had made, to keep himself safe. At dawn, he couldn't take it anymore. He saddled his horse and rode out far into the fields, to a place where the grass grew high and the wind seemed to whisper forgotten things. He tried to lose himself in his work, in the familiar strain of muscle and sweat. But it was no use. The image of their faces, one fierce, one gentle, was burned into his mind. The sound of their voices was threaded into the silence he once held so sacred. He thought about the town, the whispers that would turn into shouts, the stares that would feel like stones. A man living alone on the prairie was strange enough. But a man with two wives? He'd be more than an outcast. He'd be a monster to them, a cautionary tale. Yet when he tried to imagine sending them away, telling them to leave, the thought hollowed him out. It made him feel like he was surrendering the last piece of his humanity. The silence would return, but it wouldn't be a fortress anymore. It would be a tomb. That evening, as the sun set the horizon on fire, the sisters found him by the corral. It was Ilara who spoke first, her voice as steady and unyielding as prairie rock. She told him about the man she had been promised to back east, a cruel man, a man who saw people as possessions, who craved power more than he could ever understand love. She told him she had run not just for her life, but to keep her soul from being broken. Then Lyra, with her soft eyes, told her story. She spoke of her own people, who had always mistaken her quiet nature for weakness. They never saw the steel that lay beneath her gentleness. She said that when they saw him, they didn't see a savior. They saw a mirror, another soul that had been shaped by hardship, but had refused to surrender to bitterness. He listened with a stillness that wasn't empty. It was full of a strange, painful reverence. With every word they spoke, the walls he had built around his heart seemed to bend and groan. He no longer knew if he was defending himself from them or just hiding from a truth that had already taken root inside him. The prairie wind snatched their words and carried them away into the darkness, but their meaning stayed behind, heavy as stone. He finally realized they weren't begging him out of desperation. They were choosing him, on purpose, and in that choice there was a dignity that humbled him. But still, he hesitated. The fear was a cold knot in his gut. The nights passed in a restless torment, the weight of the decision gnawing at him. Then, one evening, the sky tore open. A furious storm rolled in, cracking the heavens with thunder and slashing the plains with sheets of rain. The sisters didn't run for cover. They walked out into the downpour and stood with him. The rain plastered their hair to their faces, the wind whipped at their clothes. And then they reached for his hands, their grip firm, as if the storm itself was demanding he finally make his choice. In that instant, a bolt of lightning lit up the entire world in a flash of fierce, brilliant white. And in that light, the truth bloomed inside him, undeniable and absolute. Love wasn't about dividing a heart, it was about abundance. What they were offering him wasn't a scandal, it was a sanctuary. He pulled them close, right there in the heart of the storm, the rain washing over the three of them. And for the first time in more years than he could count, he let himself speak words that mattered. He told them he wouldn't send them away. He told them their lives and his were now braided together, like three strands of a rope, stronger together than they could ever be apart. Their smiles, wet with rain, were brighter than any lightning. They were a light that pierced through the shadows he had lived in for so long. A few days later, after the storm had passed and the air smelled clean and new, he led them out onto the open plain under a sky overflowing with stars. There was no preacher, no town, no witnesses but the earth and the sky. But it was more than enough. He spoke his vows to them, not in the language of ownership, but of promise. He pledged to walk beside them, to protect them, for as long as he had breath in his body. Ilara's voice, when she answered, was steady as steel. Lyra's was soft as a hymn. Together, they wove their words into something that felt eternal. The moment was quiet, but inside that quiet, a power greater than any thunderstorm roared to life. The rancher, the man who had been nothing but stone and silence, felt the dry, barren ground of his heart awaken, as if love itself had struck a hidden spring deep beneath a desert. He looked at their faces, illuminated by the starlight, and he understood. He hadn't been chosen for his strength. He'd been chosen for the space he carried inside him, a space wide enough to hold two entire lives alongside his own. For the first time in memory, he didn't feel apart from the world. He felt joined to it, through them. The fire they kindled cast three long shadows on the ground, and in the flickering light, they danced and blended until they became one. He knew a truth then that both terrified and freed him. Solitude had been safe, but love was alive. It was risk and ruin, thunder and rain. But it was also the only thing on this earth that could remake him into something more than just a stone. The sisters leaned into him, their eyes bright with the same wild, daring hope. He felt the future open up before him, endless and untamed as the prairie itself. The choice was no longer a question. It was a vow, sealed by the night sky. He had stepped across the threshold of his loneliness into something vast and perilous and full of promise. As the embers of the fire cracked and the stars blazed above, he understood that the story of his life hadn't ended with that gunshot long ago. It had only just begun. But the man Alara had fled, the cruel man named Silas, was not the kind of man to let go of something he considered his property. And their newfound sanctuary was about to become a battlefield. Silas was coming, and he was bringing hell with him. Their new life began with a fragile peace. The rhythms of the ranch shifted, absorbing 2 new heartbeats. Mornings were no longer silent vigils, but a soft murmur of conversation as they planned the day. Alara's sharp intellect proved invaluable. She saw patterns in the herds, ways to improve the fences, strategies for the lean winter months. Lyra's quiet presence brought life to the dusty cabin, with wild flowers in a tin can and the scent of baking bread. For the rancher, Jedediah, they learned his name was, a name he hadn't heard spoken with kindness in a decade, it was like learning to breathe again. He found himself speaking more, short sentences at first, then longer ones. He told them about the land, his father, the way the seasons turned. He never spoke of the gunshot. That was a tomb he kept locked. One afternoon, while repairing a trough near the western fence, Alara shielded her eyes, looking out at the horizon. "Jedediah," she said, her voice tight. "Rider coming." Jed straightened up, his hand instinctively going to the pistol holstered at his hip. A lone rider, still a black speck against the shimmering heat. But he rode with an arrogance, a straight-backed confidence that set every nerve in Jed's body on edge. This wasn't a lost traveler. Lyra came out of the cabin, her face pale. She recognized the posture, the specific way the man sat his horse. "It's one of them," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's one of Silas's men." The rider didn't approach the cabin. He stopped 100 yards out, just sitting there on his horse, a silent, menacing statue. He was a message, a reminder. "I know where you are." For an hour, he sat there, unmoving, his gaze sweeping over the ranch. Then, as slowly as he arrived, he turned his horse and rode away. The fragile peace shattered. That night, the fire in the hearth seemed to offer little warmth. "He knows," Alara stated, her voice flat. It was only a matter of time. Jed looked at them, at the fear that had returned to their eyes, and a cold, familiar anger began to smolder in his chest. "Who is this Silas?" he asked, his voice a low growl. "Tell me everything," Alara told him. Silas Blackwood wasn't just a cruel suitor. He was a land baron, a predator who was swallowing up the territory piece by piece. He bought what he could, and what he couldn't buy, he took by force, by intimidation, by fire. His ranch was a fortress, his men a private army. Alara's father, a desperate man with crippling debts, had promised her to Silas in exchange for his own survival. "He doesn't want me," Alara said, her eyes flashing with a fury that matched his own. "He wants to own the last thing in this valley that won't bow to him. My father's land bordered his. With me as his wife, he would have it all." "But why come here?" Jed pressed. "This land is nothing special." Lyra looked at Alara, a silent question passing between them. Alara gave a slight nod. "Because," Lyra said softly, her voice barely audible, "we heard a story in the last town. A story about a ranch that Silas Blackwood could never take. A piece of land protected by an old territorial charter, held by a family that had paid for it in blood. A man who lived alone, who wouldn't sell, who couldn't be scared off." Jed felt a chill go down his spine that had nothing to do with the night air. The story wasn't just a story. It was true. His great-grandfather had been granted this land by the first governor. a reward for an act of bravery in a war long since forgotten. The charter was ironclad. The land could not be seized for debt or taxes and could only be passed down his bloodline. It was why his father had held on so fiercely, and it was why his father was dead. Suddenly, the gunshot from all those years ago wasn't a distant, hazy memory. It was sharp and clear. A heated argument in this very yard. A man on a fine black horse, his face contorted with rage. Jedediah's father, standing his ground. The man on the horse was Silas Blackwood's father. The bullet hadn't been meant for a boy. It had been meant to end the argument. It had been meant for his father. Jed, only a boy of 10, had been standing right there. The silence he carried wasn't just from grief. It was from the shock of a world that could be ripped apart in a single heartbeat. He looked at the two women, at their desperate hope and their terrified eyes. They hadn't just stumbled into his sanctuary. They had brought the entire war to his doorstep. They had fled from the son of the man who had murdered his father. "He won't get this land," Jed said, his voice raw with an ancient fury. "And he won't get you." The next morning, the message was no longer silent. They awoke to the acrid smell of smoke. The far pasture was on fire. It wasn't a large blaze, just a long black scar burned into the dry grass. But the meaning was unmistakable. A warning shot. "I can touch you whenever I want." Jed worked with a grim intensity he hadn't felt in years. He wasn't just enduring anymore. He was fighting back. He spent the day reinforcing the doors, boarding up the back windows of the cabin, leaving only small slits to see and shoot through. He brought the horses into the main corral, closer to the house. He took Alara and Lyra to a hidden clearing behind a rocky outcrop and handed them each a rifle. "You need to know how to use these," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Alara took the weapon with a determined look, her jaw set. Lyra flinched, her hands trembling as she held the heavy piece of steel. I can't," she whispered. "I've never held a gun." "You will learn," Jed said, his voice softer, but still firm. "Because your gentleness is a luxury we no longer have." He taught them for hours. How to load, how to aim, how to control their breathing. Alara was a natural. She was methodical, precise, her shots hitting the target with satisfying thuds. She had the mind of a strategist. But Lyra was a surprise. After her initial hesitation, something shifted in her. Her hands steadied. Her breathing evened out. She didn't just hit the target. She hit the dead center. Every single time. There was a stillness in her, a focus that was almost unnerving. The gentle soul who hummed melodies and calmed horses could send a bullet exactly where she wanted it to go, without a flicker of emotion. Jed looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not weakness, but a reservoir of hidden, terrifying strength. That night, as they cleaned the rifles by the firelight, the reality of their situation settled over them. They were 3 people against a man who commanded an army. An alliance born of desperation, bound by a vow under the stars, was now a war pact. Alara looked at him, her eyes dark in the flickering light. "This is more than you bargained for, Jedediah." "This fight found me a long time ago," he said grimly. "I just didn't know it yet." He looked down at his hands, then back up at them. "But that vow we made. It's not enough. Silas can still claim you. He could get the law on his side, say you're his promised bride, that I'm holding you here against your will." A new, cold fear entered the room. The law was a tool for men like Silas, a weapon to be used against people like them. "Then we need something more," Alara said, her mind racing. "Something the law can't deny." "A marriage certificate," Lyra whispered. "From a preacher. Something official." Jed shook his head. "The preacher in town is on Silas's payroll. Everyone is. They'd send word to him before the ink was dry. They were trapped. Their union, which felt so real and powerful to them, was just air to the outside world. It gave Silas a weakness to exploit, a way to tear them apart without firing another shot. They sat in silence, the weight of their impossible situation pressing down on them. Then Jed stood up and walked over to a dusty, forgotten chest in the corner of the cabin. It had been his father's. He hadn't opened it in 15 years. With a deep breath, he lifted the heavy lid. Inside, beneath some old blankets, was a leather-bound journal and a yellowed, folded document tied with a faded ribbon. The Territorial Charter. He handed it to Alara. Her eyes scanned the old, looping script, her breath catching. "Jedediah, listen to this," she said, her voice filled with a stunned disbelief. She read a passage from the charter aloud. It was an obscure clause, a provision for homesteaders in isolated territories. It stated that a union, declared publicly and witnessed, could be legitimized by signing and filing the charter at the territorial capital. But it was the next part that made the blood run cold. It said the charter holder could extend the protection of the land to his legal spouse or spouses, shielding them from prior claims or contracts. It was a relic of a wilder time, a law written for a world that no longer existed. A law that no one, not even Silas Blackwood, would know about. But there was a catch. A terrible, impossible catch. To be considered publicly declared and witnessed, the charter specified that the signing had to be witnessed by another landowner from the same territory. And Jedediah was the last independent landowner for 100 miles in any direction. Every single one of his neighbors had sold out to Silas Blackwood long ago. The law gave them a key, but the door was sealed shut. It was a dead end. Hope, it seemed, was still a fool's game. Lyra, who had been looking through the journal, suddenly gasped. "Jed," she said, her voice a hushed whisper. "What is the Whispering Spring?" Jed looked up, his brow furrowed. "It's just an old name for the creek that runs through the South Canyon. An old family story. My father said it was the heart of the ranch." "I don't think it's just a story," Lyra said, her finger tracing a crudely drawn map in the journal. "Your father wrote about it. He wrote that the Blackwoods didn't just want the land for grazing. They wanted the spring. He wrote, "They know the water is sweeter here than anywhere else. They know it never runs dry, not even in the worst drought. If a man controlled this spring, he would control the entire valley." And suddenly, everything clicked into place. The feud wasn't just about land or an old grudge. It was about water. In this dry, unforgiving country, water was more precious than gold. It was life. Silas wasn't trying to build an empire of cattle. He was trying to build an empire of thirst. If he controlled the only reliable water source for 100 miles, every other rancher would be his slave. He wouldn't just own the valley. He would own its future. This ranch wasn't just a home. It was the heart of the entire territory, and they were sitting right on top of it. The stakes had just escalated from survival to the fate of hundreds of people who didn't even know they were in danger. But their own problem remained. They had a weapon, the charter, but no way to fire it. They needed a witness, an impossibility. That's when Alara, who had been staring blankly at the charter, suddenly looked up, her eyes wide with a wild, desperate idea. "Wait," she said, her voice trembling with excitement. "Jed, who owns the land directly to the north? The old Miller place?" "Silas bought it 5 years ago," Jed said, his voice flat with defeat. "It's part of his northern range now." "But did he file the new deed?" Alara pressed, her words coming faster now. "Did he register it at the Capitol? Men like Silas, they get arrogant. They get sloppy with paperwork. What if the land is still officially registered to the Miller family?" It was a long shot, a 1 in a million chance. "Even if it is," Jed said, "Old Man Miller is dead. His wife moved away years ago. But they had a son, Ilara said, her eyes boring into his. I remember hearing stories in town, a disgraced son who was cast out for gambling and drinking. They said he ran off to the mining camps in the mountains. A disgraced son, an outcast, a man with no love for Silas Blackwood, who had taken his family's land. He was a ghost, a forgotten man. But if they could find him, he was also a landowner, and he was their only hope. The plan was insane. The mountain mining camps were 100 miles of hostile territory away, crawling with Silas's men. One of them would have to go, leaving the other two to defend the ranch. It was a suicide mission. I'll go, Jed said immediately. I know the land. No, Ilara said, her voice firm as iron. You are the charter holder. You are the one Silas wants dead above all else. If you leave, this ranch is vulnerable. They'll take it, and they'll take us. Lyra is the best shot. We need her here for defense. It has to be me. The thought of her going alone into that wilderness made Jed's blood run cold, but he knew she was right. Her mind was the sharpest. She was the strategist. If anyone could talk their way through Silas's patrols and find one disgraced man in a mountain of miners, it was her. They argued late into the night, but Ilara's logic was undeniable. At dawn, she was ready. She was dressed in men's clothing, her hair tucked up under a wide-brimmed hat. She carried a rifle, a small pack of supplies, and a look of grim determination. Lyra, she said, turning to her sister, you are not weak. You are the wall this house stands behind. Do not let it fall. Then she turned to Jed. The air between them was thick with unspoken words. He just reached out and gripped her shoulder. Come back, he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. I will, she promised. And then she was gone, a small, resolute figure disappearing into the vast, dangerous landscape. The days that followed were the longest of Jed's life. The silence that returned to the ranch was different now. It wasn't empty. It was filled with a taut, screaming tension. Every gust of wind sounded like hoofbeats. Every shadow looked like one of Silas's men. He and Lyra fell into a grim routine. They patrolled the perimeter. They reinforced the cabin. They barely spoke, their shared anxiety a constant, oppressive presence. Lyra's gentleness was gone, replaced by a cold, watchful focus. She spent hours in the high rocks overlooking the ranch, her rifle resting comfortably in her arms, her eyes scanning the horizon. On the third day, their fears were realized. A patrol of 5 of Silas's men rode boldly onto their land. They didn't stop 100 yards away this time. They rode right up to the corral, their faces arrogant and cruel. Blackwood wants the women, their leader sneered, a man with a jagged scar across his face. And the deed to this pathetic scrap of dirt. Give them to us, and he might let you live. Jed stood on the porch of the cabin, his shotgun held loosely in his hands. This is my land, he said, his voice a low rumble. Get off it. The man chuckled. Brave words for a dead man. He raised his pistol, but before he could fire, a rifle shot cracked from the rocks above. The man's hat flew from his head, a neat hole punched through the crown. The men stared up in stunned confusion. A second shot kicked up the dirt right in front of the lead horse's hooves, making it rear up in terror. It was Lyra. The next one won't miss. Jed's voice echoed in the sudden, tense silence. The men, unnerved by a threat they couldn't see, exchanged nervous glances. They were bullies and thugs, not soldiers. They weren't prepared for a real fight. With a curse, the leader wheeled his horse around. This ain't over, he snarled before they galloped away in a cloud of dust. Jed looked up towards the rocks, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and awe. Lyra had saved them. The quiet girl who hummed songs had held off 5 armed men without shedding a drop of blood. But they both knew it was just a temporary victory. The next time, Silas would send more men, an army, and they wouldn't be scared off so easily. Meanwhile, 100 miles away, Alara was in her own private hell. She'd managed to avoid Silas's patrols by traveling through the treacherous, little-known canyons. She reached the mining camp, a chaotic, lawless town carved into the mountainside, teeming with desperate men. Finding one man in this swirling mess seemed impossible. She spent a day listening, asking careful, guarded questions. The name Miller was met with blank stares, but the description, a drunk, a gambler, a man cast out from the valley, finally got a flicker of recognition. They called him Jinx. She found him in the back of a smoky, dirt-floored saloon, losing his last few coins at a card game. He was thin, haggard, his face etched with failure. He looked nothing like a savior. She waited until he was thrown out of the saloon, penniless and drunk. She cornered him in a dark alley. "Your name is Thomas Miller," she said, her voice low and urgent. He flinched, his eyes wide with fear. "Who's asking?" "Someone who hates Silas Blackwood as much as you do," she said. She told him everything. The ranch, the charter, the sisters, the fight for the land that was once his. She offered him a deal. His signature, his testimony as a witness, in exchange for enough money to disappear forever. He looked at her, his eyes clouded with booze and self-pity. "Silas will kill me," he whimpered. "He'll kill us all if you don't help," she countered, her voice sharp. "This is your one chance to spit on your father's grave and Blackwood's at the same time. To do one thing right." She saw a flicker of the old anger in his eyes, a spark of the pride that had been buried under years of failure. He hesitated, torn between fear and a chance at a redemption he never thought he'd get. But before he could answer, two large figures stepped into the mouth of the alley, blocking their only escape. They were Silas's men. Someone in the saloon had recognized her, had sent word. Her desperate gamble had failed. She was caught. And back at the ranch, the real army had just arrived. Jed and Lyra watched from the windows of the cabin as a dozen riders, led by Silas Blackwood himself, surrounded their home. There was no escape. The siege had begun. The world shrank to the size of the small, fortified cabin. Outside, Silas Blackwood sat on his fine black horse, the very image of his father all those years ago. He was a man radiating an impatient, violent power. He didn't bother with threats this time. He just gave a signal, and the shooting started. Bullets slammed into the wooden walls of the cabin, splintering the logs, shattering the last remaining panes of glass. Jed and Lyra flattened themselves against the floor, the noise deafening. They were pinned down, hopelessly outgunned. Jed crawled to one of the shooting slits, raised his shotgun, and fired into the mass of riders. A man screamed and fell from his horse. It was a small victory, but it enraged the attackers. The hail of bullets intensified. "We can't stay here!" Jed yelled over the din. "They'll tear the place apart!" "The root cellar!" Lyra shouted back. It was their only chance. A small, dark space under the floorboards, its entrance hidden beneath a bearskin rug. During a lull in the shooting, they scrambled to the trapdoor and plunged into the damp, earthy darkness below, pulling the door shut just as another volley of shots ripped through the cabin floor above them. They were trapped in a coffin, listening to their home being destroyed above them. The smell of gunpowder and splintered wood filled the small space. Hours passed. The shooting eventually stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. Then they heard the heavy tread of boots on the floorboards above. Silas's men were inside the cabin, ransacking the place. "They're not here!" a voice shouted. "Must have run for it." "Burn it!" Silas's cold voice commanded from outside. "Burn it all to the ground. If I can't have the land, no one will." Jed and Lyra exchanged a look of pure terror. They smelled the smoke before they saw it, a thin, acrid tendril snaking through the cracks in the trapdoor. The heat began to build. The crackle of flames grew louder. They were going to be burned alive. Back in the mining camp, the alley was a trap. The two thugs advanced on Alara and Miller, grinning cruelly. Silas sends his regards, one of them growled. Alara shoved Miller behind her, raising her rifle. Get back, she warned. They laughed. A little lady with a big gun. What are you going to do? Shoot us? She did. She didn't aim to kill. She aimed for the kneecap of the man on the left. Her shot was instantaneous, the sound echoing like a thunderclap in the narrow alley. The man screamed, a high, agonized sound, and crumpled to the ground. The other man stared in shock, his arrogance vanishing, replaced by disbelief and fear. That moment of hesitation was all Alara needed. She swung the heavy rifle like a club, cracking it across the second man's jaw. He staggered back, stunned, and she didn't stop. She was a whirlwind of fury, a cornered animal fighting for her life. She brought the butt of the rifle down on his head, and he collapsed in a heap. She stood there, breathing heavily, the adrenaline coursing through her. Miller was staring at her, his mouth agape, a newfound respect and terror in his eyes. The deal still stands, Alara said, her voice ragged but steady. Are you in? He just nodded, speechless. They didn't have time to waste. They scrambled out of the alley, leaving the two men groaning on the ground. They stole 2 horses and rode like the devil himself was on their tail, pushing the animals to their absolute limit. They rode through the night, 100 miles of desperation ahead of them, a slim hope of reaching the ranch before it was too late. Alara knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that Silas would not have waited. The final battle was already happening. In the root cellar, the heat was becoming unbearable. Smoke was filling their lungs, making them cough and choke. The roar of the fire above was a living thing, a monster devouring their world. We're not dying here, Jed choked out, his eyes streaming. He pushed against the trap door. It was hot to the touch, but it budged. He shoved it open a few inches. The cabin above was an inferno of orange and black. The fire was concentrated in the main room. The small bedroom at the back wasn't fully engulfed yet. It was their only way out. We run for the back window, he yelled. On 3. 1, 2, 3. They burst out of the cellar, covering their faces as a wall of heat hit them. They scrambled through the smoke-filled main room, embers raining down around them. They crashed through the bedroom door and hurled themselves through the small boarded-up window, shattering the frame and tumbling out onto the dirt outside. They landed hard, gasping for clean air, their lungs burning. The cabin was a roaring funeral pyre. Silas and his men were watching it burn, laughing, their faces lit by the destructive flames. They hadn't seen Jed and Lyra escape, but their escape route was cut off. They were trapped between the burning building and Silas's men. Silas finally saw them. His laughter died. His face twisted into a mask of pure fury. "Kill them!" he hissed. "Kill them now!" His men raised their rifles. It was over. A patch of open ground, nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. Jed shoved Lyra behind him, shielding her with his body, preparing for the impact of the bullets. He thought of Alara. He had failed her. He had failed them all. And then he heard it, a sound like a swarm of angry hornets, not one shot, but dozens, coming from the direction of the canyon. Silas's men cried out in pain and confusion, grabbing at wounds, falling from their horses. The attack was sudden, shocking, and devastatingly effective. Silas stared into the darkness, his face a mixture of rage and disbelief. From the mouth of the canyon, figures emerged, not soldiers, ranchers, farmers, men Jed hadn't spoken to in years, the same men who had whispered about him, who had sold their land to Silas. They were armed with hunting rifles, shotguns, old pistols, anything they could find. And at their head rode Alara, her face grim and smoke-stained, Thomas Miller riding beside her, looking terrified but resolute. When she had fled the mining camp, Alara knew they couldn't make it back to the ranch alone. So she'd taken another gamble. She didn't ride straight for the ranch. She rode to the homesteads, the ones Silas now owned, where the former owners now worked as his tenants, trapped in a cycle of debt and despair. She didn't offer them money. She offered them a different kind of payment, hope, She told them about the charter. She told them about the spring, Silas's plan to control the valley's water, to make them all his slaves forever. And she showed them Thomas Miller, the ghost of their own past, a living symbol of what they had all lost. She lit a spark of rebellion that had been smoldering for years. It was a ragtag army born of desperation, and they had arrived at the last possible second. The tables had turned. Silas and his remaining men were now the ones who were outnumbered. The battle was short and brutal. The ranchers, fighting for their homes, for their future, were a force of pure fury. In the chaos, Silas saw his empire crumbling. He spurred his horse, trying to flee, but Jed was on him in an instant, tackling him from the saddle. They crashed to the ground, a tangle of limbs and raw hatred. It wasn't a fight. It was an exorcism. Jed rained down blows on the man whose family had destroyed his. All the rage, all the grief, all the years of silence pouring out of his fists. He was about to deliver the final killing blow when Alara's hand gripped his shoulder. "No, Jed," she said, her voice cutting through his rage. "Not like this. We don't become him to beat him. Justice, not vengeance." The fight was over. Silas's men were captured, his power broken. As the sun began to rise, casting a pink glow on the smoldering ruins of the cabin, the territorial marshal, summoned by one of the ranchers, finally arrived to take a battered and defeated Silas Blackwood away in chains. They had won. Jed stood with Alara and Lyra, the three of them watching the sunrise. His home was gone. But for the first time, he wasn't alone. He was surrounded by a community he didn't know he had, by two women who had walked through fire with him. He held up the charter, the old yellow document that had saved them all. Miller stepped forward and, with a shaking hand, signed his name as a witness. The pact was sealed. Their union was now unbreakable, recognized by the oldest law in the land. They stood on the ashes of the old life, the smoke still rising around them. The silence that had defined Jed for so long was gone forever, replaced by the murmur of conversation, the promises of rebuilding, the feeling of three lives braided so tightly together that nothing could ever tear them apart. They had lost a house, but they had saved the valley. And in the ashes, they were about to build something far stronger. A home, a future, an unconventional family that had become the unlikely heart of it all. The story of the silent rancher was over. A new story, their story, was just beginning. And it would be a story told not in whispers, but with the roar of a love that had defied the world and won. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more tales of justice and redemption. And let me know in the comments, what do you think was the most surprising twist? Until next time, stay safe out there.